Okay, welcome to part one of the subtractive sculpting demo. Tools you'll need are your rasp, loop tool. I use a steak knife too for this with a serrated blade and a Sharpie marker. The serrated blade will just help you with the roughing out portion. Some people might use a wallboard saw that's used in drywall. Even a hacksaw might be helpful. If you don't have either of those, your rasp will work. It'll just be a little bit slower. So as you can see, I first start, of course I have my oil clay model beside me, and I first start by looking at one face of the sculpture. I outlined it, so I'm just removing material that I see needs to be removed from the bird's eye view. I was able to place my actual oil clay model on the foam block. It all depends on how big your oil clay model is. And of course, I want you to use as much of that foam block as you possibly can. So uh, you need to enlarge your oil clay model. Mine's probably twice the size, or will end up being twice the size of the oil clay model. At this point, I'm using my steak knife or my serrated blade. If you're working on really large scale fabrication, some artists might use a bandsaw or a hot wire. If you have access to these tools, you're welcome to use them. If you use the hot wire, make sure you're in a well ventilated space. At some points I switch back and forth with the rasp just to round out some edges. You'll also notice that I don't cut back to my line immediately. This is a very slow process, so I start at the edge of the block and I chisel away small bits at a time. You don't want to hack off a large portion because it could fracture the block and make a weak point, make the piece fall apart where you don't want it to break. So right now I'm simply looking at the silhouette from a bird's eye perspective. I'm not worried about the side view, not worried about worm's eye view. I'm just trying to get an idea. And here I'm comparing my model again, and I just have a rough silhouette from the bird's eye. Now I'm going to look at the profile. Okay, so that bird's eye gave me some registration points. And you can see I'm just getting a really rough idea of the silhouette. And now I'm going to start removing material again with my serrated knife. Starting at the bottom and just slowly chunking off little pieces up to the line. I don't start at the line and try to chunk off a large piece. This is a slow process, so don't get too impatient. We have 4 whole weeks for this project. I gave you extra time for this project because the process of subtractive sculpting is so labor intensive. So now I'm looking at the profile. I was just looking at the primary contour. Now I'm starting to look at secondary contours. Those are the lines that are on the interior of the form. These will help define the negative space that we see on the inside. And this also helps give me some registration points, some points of reference. Now I'm looking at the bird's eye view again and slowly refining that. Constantly flipping the sculpture around and working on different faces. And you also notice that as I remove registration lines, the Sharpie lines, I draw them back in and I slowly get more and more specific. And I see that crescent shape, so I'm going to start to define that crescent shape. If you have large holes in your piece, in your final design, feel free to use a drill bit Just be very careful because it is a power tool, if it's connected to a drill, of course. And you don't want to it'll remove material very quickly. So you just want to be careful if you're using a power tool for this. I'll be using all hand tools. Another safety tip is to always know where your helping hand is. So your helping hand is the hand that's not using the tool, hand that's holding the foam in place. I've seen many students forget where their helping hand is and accidentally brush over it with a rasp and remove some skin, or accidentally slice into their helping hand with their serrated blade, which is not fun. So I'm always aware of where my helping hand is and how close it is to the moving tool. Back to my steak knife here, I'm just slowly chiseling off up to that line. This is firm foam. Some people choose to use soft floral foam. And there's a benefit, of course, to using a softer material. It's much easier to sculpt. It's also more fragile and easier to deform. So I really am happy with the stiffness of this foam. It takes a while to sculpt, but it's less likely to fracture and dimple as you work with it. And you'll notice that I'm writing bottom and top, so that just gives me visual reference points as I'm sculpting so I can remember which face I'm working with. And I always try to have the model relating to the foam sculpture, constantly looking back and forth between the foam and the model. Now I'm trying to get that deep crease with my knife. And you'll also notice that I'm standing as I sculpt. This helps me have more mobility and control. It's more comfortable for my body to stand and sculpt. Just something to be aware of. I'm doing this in my basement studio where it's okay to make a much bigger mess. This is a dusty process, so just beware. And sometimes I'll even mark an X on certain portions so I know that that portion needs to be removed. And I go back and forth between using the side of the blade and the tip of the blade, but continuously shaving off small bits up to the line, not starting at the line. And this first part, sculptors call roughing out. So you're getting a rough idea of the primary and secondary contour lines. So basically the silhouette, the outside silhouette of the piece, and the interior negative spaces of the piece. This isn't going to look like a refined sculpture at the end of this demonstration. It's going to look like a very rough version of the piece. You'll be able to see it start to come to shape, but I still have a long way to go after this demo is complete. I would reserve about at least 3 to 5 hours for roughing out your piece. Of course, it all depends on the complexity of your design. At this point, I'm trying to get the concave portion better defined of that crescent side. Now I'm trying to refine the rounded exterior portion. A really strong design should be able to be rotated around and have interest from all sides. And one thing to observe with the rasp tool, I'm not using the rasp at this point, but I'll bounce back and forth between the knife and the rasp. The rasp has a flat face and a rounded face. So when you use it, make sure that you're aware of which side is removing material. The rounded face would be good to use for rounded profiles, of course, and then the flat face would be good to use if you have flat facets or flat planes on your sculpture. So just be aware that both sides don't work exactly the same. I use the loop tool, the small loop tool, just a little bit towards the end of this demo, but when you initially start to rough out the sculpture, you'll be using serrated knife and the rasp, mostly the knife. Here I'm using the loop tool to get into this interior space. Since it has a deeper center, the rasp and the knife won't do that. And you'd be surprised at how much material this small loop tool will remove. Back to the loop tool. There are larger versions of loop tools that we use in ceramics. They sell those at Hobby Lobby. If you are a tool collector and you want to find more specific tools for this project, you're welcome to shop around for different size loop tools. Various wood carving tools would also work well for this project. Chisels and gouges would work well. Again, just be aware when you're using those tools of where your helping hand is. Now I'm using the rasp. And at this point, I'm trying to get that negative space in the center. So I keep flipping the sculpture back and forth, trying to get those two um, concave portions to meet to form a small hole. I want to start with a really small negative space and then carve it bigger. With subtractive sculpture, once it's gone, it's gone. I can't glue material back in place or stick it back in place like oil clay. So I really want to slowly remove material, not start with what the final sculpture will look like. This is a continuous demo, but be aware that my hands and arms are used to this kind of continuous movement. So feel free to take a break at certain points to rest your hands, especially if you start to get cramping in your hands and forearms. You'll want to rest and stretch, maybe take a walk. And you can see here I've created a small pinhole, and I'll slowly carve around that hole to make it larger and more refined. But that definitely gives me orientation. And this is what I want you guys to work on. Just roughing out the form. Some things to keep in mind, helpful tips: make sure you rotate your sculpture often. I'm sure you saw me doing that. Don't get too specific or too thin. Those portions will break off. Always know where your helping hand is. Give yourself a break when you get frustrated or confused. Rest. And enjoy the challenge and celebrate the amazing talents of your mind and hands. Have fun.